In discussions about evolution, you've probably heard comments about how similar we are to other organisms. You might have heard numbers like we're 98% similar to our nearest relatives, the chimpanzees. But there's something way, way more fundamental that makes it absolutely clear that evolution really happened. You see, when people talk about how similar we are to other organisms, a lot of times they're talking about sequences of the genetic letters that are very similar between us and other organisms. This is a very basic technique that is used even in determining something like who you're related to or on a paternity test. These kinds of assumptions are built into the way genetics works. But there's something even more fundamental than this. Those genetic letters, the A's, C's, T's, and G's that make the base pairs that are your DNA, they're shared by every organism on Earth. Just think about that for a second. If you and any other organism were truly unrelated, there's no reason for you to have the same genetic letters. There just isn't. But it goes beyond that also. We're not just made up of the same genetic letters as every other organism on Earth. We even translate those genetic letters into proteins using the same translation table. This means that the arrangement of the letters isn't just similar. The letters themselves aren't just similar, but even the way that the arrangement of the letters in your DNA correspond to actual protein arrangements when the peptides line up according to their amino acid sequence, those amino acids correlate in the same way in every organism. That means a fruit fly, a tree, you, and a fish all use the same translation table. If living organisms weren't related, we would expect them at minimum to use different translation patterns. We'd probably also expect them to use entirely different DNA letters. In fact, if you were designing living organisms on a planet, the clearest way you could show that these organisms were designed and not descended from a common ancestor would be to simply make sure that they each use a different set of base pairs in their DNA, or at minimum that they use different translations. Here's a rough analogy for you to think about what this would be like. Imagine a word that sounds very, very similar in multiple different languages. Take, for example, a word that is nearly identical in a parent language like Latin and in the descendant languages like the other Romance languages, say French, Spanish, and Italian. It's unsurprising that a word could be so similar across all of these related languages. But what would be shocking would be if a language on the opposite side of the world that had never come in contact with and did not descend from the same parent language were to actually have the same spelling or a similar spelling. It would be highly improbable. Now, on top of all of that, the classical number that you hear of, say, 98% similarity between human and chimp DNA is largely true, which is, of course, what we'd expect. Sometimes people describe this as simply being similar feature sets and therefore requiring similar DNA instructions. That's not true. You could direct the composition of two very similar organisms using completely different DNA instructions. It's not even necessary for there to be a 1% overlap. On top of that, what is especially fascinating is that the most similar genetic organisms to us, like the chimpanzees, they're not just similar in the portions of your DNA that code for functional traits like specific proteins. The DNA of a chimp and a human are also incredibly similar in the non coding regions. In fact, one of the most dramatic examples of this is that the insertion and distribution of endogenous retroviruses is nearly identical across humans and chimps, with the sole exception of endogenous retroviruses that have invaded the genome of humans and chimps, respectively, since the divergence of these two lineages from a common ancestor. This series of endogenous retroviruses, or ERVs, tells us that their DNA came from a shared ancestor. The DNA tells a fascinating story that evolution really happened.